Trade war is in nobody's interest.
President Trump's tariffs is a major blow to the world economy.
Our old relationship of steadily deepening integration with the United States is over.
What would happen if the United States economy, the financial pillar of the world, suddenly fell into recession? Not only Americans will be affected, but even countries half a world away will feel the widespread aftershocks. In every meal, every electricity bill, every sleep weighed down by anxiety. If the US falters, many countries could collapse as well. In today's video, we will sequentially explore 10 countries, from close neighbors to economic rivals, that are deeply dependent on the financial power of the United States. Places where just a sneeze from the US economy can throw an entire nation into chaos. Are you ready? Because this list might make you see the world through a completely different lens. And if you have relatives in these countries, stay tuned until the end to understand why their future sometimes depends on America. President Donald Trump called the global tariff policy he announced last week a day of liberation. But for millions of others, it is nothing short of an apocalypse, because this policy could cost millions of people their jobs, a price too high for a political statement. And the consequences do not stop at the borders of the United States. In Canada, businesses are shaking in the face of this wave of change. The owner of a handmade jewelry business near St. John shared that more than 90% of her customers are currently in the US, and the idea of the tariffs imposed by Trump makes her feel worried. Do you think Canada is a stable, prosperous country that can be immune to crises in the US? But the truth is not that simple. In fact, Canada is not only a close neighbor, but also a country tied to the economic lifeblood of the US. And if one day the American economy collapses, Canada, despite having done nothing wrong, will have to pay a heavy price. The United States is Canada's largest trading partner, with approximately 77% of Canada's exports being sent to the US. It is estimated that approximately $2 billion worth of goods cross between the two countries every day. The energy, automotive, lumber, and especially the service industries are all closely tied to American consumer demand. If the US falls into recession, the Canadian economy will be dragged down with it, and faster than you think. Dennis Darby, President and CEO of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association, shared, "Since the US began threatening tariffs, from border security reasons to steel, aluminum, and now cars, the Canadian manufacturing sector has come to a standstill. No one is investing more, no one is hiring more. Even some places have started laying off employees. Now Canadians are starting to feel the consequences of the tariffs announced by Trump. The most noticeable effect is inflation. Everything has become more expensive than ever. From cans of soda, beer to office furniture, any product that uses steel and aluminum has increased in price." Mr. Darby warned, "If demand from the US declines, that's bad news for Canadian workers and for our economy as well." The truth is that a deep recession in the United States will trigger a domino effect in Canada. Businesses go bankrupt en masse due to losing the market. The loonie is losing value significantly. Interest rates are rising to curb inflation, but they are suffocating borrowers. The bustling, prosperous streets of Canada could be replaced by a haunting silence. Workers lose their jobs and cannot afford to pay their home loans. Young people give up on the dream of owning a home because house prices are no longer tied to income. Middle-class families are forced to rely on food banks. According to experts, the instability from the US is a wake-up call for Canada to focus on investing in strategic infrastructure. If the US is no longer a reliable partner, Canada needs to develop an east-west transportation system and boost exports to other markets. This requires political parties, regardless of who is in power, to take strong action on infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, and pipelines. Can a country like Canada, with a solid foundation and high level of education, withstand the shock from its southern neighbor? Or is this the time we need to reconsider the too close relationship between the two economies and ask ourselves, when the US sneezes, can Canada avoid the flu? Do you think Mexico can be safe from the impact of a recession in the US? The answer is very difficult. These two economies are so deeply intertwined that they cannot be separated. Every year, billions of dollars worth of goods circulate between the US and Mexico. Just in 2023 alone, about 80% of Mexico's total export value was sent to the US. Among them, key items such as automobiles, electronics, and agricultural products, which are major pillars of the Mexican economy, all depend on the purchasing power of American consumers. When the US falls into recession, consumer demand in the US decreases, and the Mexican economy could spiral downward. More than 30 million jobs in Mexico depend directly or indirectly on American consumer demand. If the US economy suddenly declines, Mexico will immediately bear the heavy consequences. Unemployment will escalate rapidly. Poverty will spread within just a few months, but that's not the worst part yet. Currently, millions of Mexican families rely on remittances, the money their relatives send back from the United States. In 2023, this figure reached 63 billion US dollars, nearly equivalent to the entire national healthcare budget. If wages in the US decrease, remittances will also plummet, leaving impoverished communities struggling to cope. A country pushed to the brink of complete collapse. If there are no support policies or economic restructuring, Mexico may face a generation of mass unemployed youth, easily drawn into criminal organizations. The wave of migration is increasing, making the US-Mexico border crisis even more tense. The loss of trust in the government and in the dream of a decent life in one's homeland. Is it fair that millions of Mexicans have to pay the price for a recession in the US, even though they have no right to vote, no voice? If you have ever worked with Mexicans or know about the deeply intertwined communities between the two countries, you understand that we cannot be separated. China is often seen as America's #1 geopolitical rival. But the truth is more complicated than that. The United States is China's largest export market. From electronics, consumer goods, to production components, most are manufactured in China and sold to the US. In 2023, the total export turnover from China to the US reached over 575 billion US dollars, a colossal figure that constitutes a large portion of foreign currency revenue. If the US goes into recession, consumer spending declines, and American businesses go bankrupt, Chinese goods will have no market. And what will happen? Factories are closing down. Millions of workers lose their jobs. The shadow credit system has defaulted. The housing crisis continues to spread, a threshold that China has reached since the collapse of real estate giants like Evergrande Country Garden. But the more frightening thing is that the Chinese people, those who are struggling to make a living, will be the first to bear the consequences. Imagine a young man from the countryside coming to Shenzhen to work, now being laid off without insurance. A family borrowed money to buy an apartment, but now the project is abandoned and no one is coming to their rescue. An elderly retiree no longer receives their pension on time because the local government has run out of budget. China is stuck in a vicious cycle of debt, real estate, exports, unemployment. And if the locomotive is the United States derails, the entire system will shake along. Although the Chinese government maintains an appearance of stability, beneath the surface a wave of discontent is rising, from the unemployed middle class to farmers without land to cultivate and unemployed graduates. If China cannot recover, they will have to struggle to regain their position in a rapidly changing world. Rising debt, weakening demand, and an uncertain future, China may no longer be the economic fortress we once thought. India has long been called an emerging power, a place with a large population, advanced technology, and many valuable natural resources. This country is also likened to the workshop and office of the world, but many people do not realize that most of their growth wheels are turning thanks to money and demand from the United States. And if the US falls into recession, India's growth engine risks stalling forever. The United States is India's largest export market, with key sectors such as pharmaceuticals, apparel, information technology, and customer services. Nearly 60% of India's software industry revenue comes from American companies. The tech giants in Bengaluru and Hyderabad, cities dubbed the Silicon Valley of India, are also thriving on funds from the US. More than 4 million Indian workers are indirectly employed by American corporations, from IT staff and call center employees to software engineers. The remittances sent back by Indians living in the US are a vital source of livelihood for many poor states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And if the US economy slows down, the first thing American companies do is cut IT budgets and stop outsourcing. And you know what that means? Millions of Indian workers will lose their jobs, salaries will be cut, and projects will be canceled. The crisis doesn't stop there. A large part of the Indian economy also relies on remittances from Indian workers abroad, especially from the United States. If the economic downturn causes workers to lose their jobs or reduce their incomes, the flow of remittances back home will dwindle. The consequence is that millions of families fall into hardship, pushing more people into the cycle of poverty. The informal economy, which accounts for 80% of the workforce, will be heavily impacted, pushing millions of people back into poverty. In addition, social unrest is increasing in major urban areas. The wealth gap is sparking conflicts, threatening political stability. It can be seen that India's dependence on the US is not just in the market. It permeates every meal, every dream, and every hope of millions of Indian people. And the most frightening thing, millions of young people, who are the future of the country, will lose faith in the Indian dream. Can a country of 1.4 billion people, where hundreds of young people learn to code every minute, stand firm if their largest customer, the United States, collapses? And if that happens, are we ready to face millions of lost people, not because they didn't try, but because the world they served has ceased to exist? India could be the future of the world or a painful warning of invisible dependency. South Korea, a country praised for its leading technology corporations and K-pop culture that has a global presence, seems independent and proud. But behind that glory lies a tightly bound economic tether to the US. And if America goes into recession, this Asian tiger could lose its claws. In fact, the United States is South Korea's second largest export partner, after China. Corporations like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai are deeply reliant on American consumer demand, especially in the fields of phones, chips, cars, and EV batteries. About 20% of South Korea's total semiconductor chip production is exported to the US, an industry that accounts for more than 15% of the country's GDP. A sudden recession in the US will sharply reduce the demand for Korean goods. When Americans cut back on spending, the revenues of Samsung, LG, and Hyundai will plummet. Waves of layoffs affecting tens of thousands of workers in South Korea will occur, especially the semiconductor industry, which is the backbone of exports for South Korea, will suffer heavy losses. American tech corporations, the largest customers of Korean chip lines, will cut their budgets, causing the entire supply chain to tremble. Additionally, if the US raises interest rates to combat recession, it could lead to capital outflows from South Korea, causing the won to depreciate and import prices to surge. With a country that has the highest household debt ratio in the world, an economic crisis could push many people into personal bankruptcy and mental breakdown. But that is just the beginning. This shock will spread throughout the entire South Korean economy. In a society already under pressure from competition and the stigma of success, the US recession could be the final factor, causing many South Koreans to lose direction and resolve. A well-educated younger generation will no longer believe in the promise that hard work will lead to success. And in a country where national pride is a sacred value, this injury can spread to social trust as well. An even worse thing is, other East Asian countries, which depend on goods from South Korea, will also be swept along. We often think of South Korea as a success story, and rightly so, they have achieved a lot. But perhaps that very success is built on an unstable foundation, dependence on the United States. If the US economy falters, can South Korea avoid the fever? Brazil, a country that possesses the magnificent Amazon rainforest, abundant resources, the sixth largest population in the world, and the largest economy in South America. Looking strong and independent on the outside, how could it easily collapse just because the US is in recession? But the truth is that this country is standing on a fragile economic foundation, tightly linked to the pulse of the US dollar and consumption from the United States. And if America stumbles, Brazil could roll down a slippery slope. The United States is Brazil's second largest trading partner after China, particularly in key industries such as aviation, steel, oil, and agricultural products. Nearly 30% of foreign investment in Brazil comes from American companies, ranging from banks to the fast food and retail sectors. The Brazilian real fluctuates significantly with interest rates and the strength of the US dollar, making the economy vulnerable when the US experiences volatility. The agricultural sector, which largely relies on trade with the US, will plummet uncontrollably, with profits severely declining. In the context of Brazil's already high unemployment rate, any trade shock will further deepen the chasm between the rich and the poor, exacerbating poverty. But that's not where it ends. Brazil's public debt has now skyrocketed, making the country extremely vulnerable to global fluctuations. If the US falls into recession, global commodity prices, especially oil, will plummet. At that time, Brazil's oil exports would be severely hit, causing the real to depreciate, inflation to surge, and widespread social protests to potentially erupt. Imagine a country already struggling with inequality, unemployment, and debt, now on the brink of total economic collapse. Brazil, the land of festivals, football, and the Amazon, can it withstand when the United States, its largest trading partner, stumbles? And when looking at countries far from the borders, can we dare to admit each financial upheaval in the US can stir a storm in another continent? Have you ever wondered, could a recession in the US devastate the Turkish economy? Two countries that seem unrelated are actually more economically intertwined than we think. Although Turkey is a NATO member and has the 19th largest economy in the world, it largely relies on foreign investment, borrows in USD, and has a complex economic military relationship with the West, especially the United States. Currently, Turkey is shouldering a foreign debt of over 450 billion US dollars, most of which is denominated in USD and euros. When the US economy declines, global interest rates rise, the US dollar strengthens, and international investors withdraw from emerging markets, Turkey is one of the first victims. The lira has depreciated by more than 80% over the past 5 years, and if the flow of money from the West withdraws, it could continue to plummet without breaks. The consequences do not stop at the numbers. The people of Turkey have been experiencing a prolonged cost of living crisis. Food prices have doubled in just 2 years. Medications are scarce. The healthcare and education systems are overwhelmed. Inflation in 2024 has exceeded 60%, and a global recession could drive prices out of control. You might meet a middle-class family in Istanbul who have to cut their electricity for 4 hours each day to save on bills. A technical student was forced to drop out because the tuition fees increased and the part-time job salary was not enough to live on. An elderly person who used to be a civil servant now has to sell snacks on the street to afford medicine. Imagine a scenario where Western investments are completely withdrawn, the export sector is stagnant, and the currency depreciates daily. Turkey will face not only economic recession, but also political and social instability. But the question is, if Turkey's economy collapses, who will save the ordinary people? Not the tycoons, not the government, but it is them, those who once believed in stability, but now have to face an uncertain future. Argentina does not need an economic shock to fall into chaos, because they have been living in crisis. But if the US goes into recession, it could be the last straw, leading to a comprehensive financial collapse. Argentina heavily depends on the international financial market, especially the US, to restructure its debt and attract investment. This country has defaulted more than 9 times in 70 years and is currently struggling to repay foreign loans, mostly in USD. When the US faces a crisis, interest rates rise and investors withdraw their funds, Argentina not only loses its vital cash flow, but also faces immediate debt tightening. Currently, inflation in Argentina has exceeded 200%, one of the highest rates in the world. People have to stand in long lines to buy food, with prices changing weekly, even daily. And if the US economy collapses, causing a global shock, the people of Argentina will have nothing left to cling to. Imagine a single mother in Buenos Aires having to change jobs 3 times in a year because the currency is devaluing too quickly. An elderly man who used to get by on his pension is now forced to collect recyclables to make ends meet. Or the children who suffer from malnutrition because milk and meat have become luxury items. If there is no stability from the outside, especially from the United States, Argentina will lose the ability to import medicines, machinery, and necessities. The peso could completely collapse. International financial organizations turn their backs. The education, healthcare, and social welfare systems, which were already weak, will collapse. The people of Argentina have suffered too much. Do they deserve to bear an additional global crisis just because a superpower on the other side of the hemisphere has collapsed? But the story doesn't end here. Argentina may just be the first link in the chain, a domino effect in which many other developing countries will also be caught up in the whirlwind of global economic turmoil. On the surface, Saudi Arabia seems stable, rich in oil, with high public spending and building future cities like Neom. But behind that ambition lies a worrying truth. Saudi Arabia remains heavily dependent on the United States, both for the oil market and for the capital and technology for modernization projects. More than 90% of this country's revenue comes from oil exports, and the United States has long been one of their largest customers. If the US economy goes into recession, the demand for oil will plummet, causing global oil prices to drop sharply. The entire financial system of Saudi Arabia, which relies on oil, could be shaken to its core. You might think that Saudi Arabia has huge reserves to cope, but the reality is, oil is not only the main export commodity, but also the backbone of the entire economy. Without a stable cash flow from oil, a series of multi-billion-dollar projects to diversify the economy will come to a standstill. And as the unemployment rate skyrockets, the people begin to lose patience, a wave of social unrest could erupt right in the heart of the Middle East. And what will happen to the Saudi people? Millions of migrant workers, who are the backbone of the economy, could be laid off en masse. Young Saudis, who once hoped for a modern future, may see their dreams shattered. The government will be forced to cut subsidies, something that has been a social foundation for decades. And in a society undergoing transformation, this instability could ignite discontent. Imagine a country once considered wealthy, suddenly unable to pay civil servants, unable to maintain domestic fuel prices, and its people facing widespread unemployment for the first time. That is no longer a distant prospect. If the US stumbles, Saudi Arabia will feel the aftershocks immediately, not through oil, but through the daily lives of its people, their unfulfilled dreams, and the loss of faith in the future. Nigeria, with over 220 million people, has long been regarded as a potential powerhouse of Africa. Rich in resources, a young population, a favorable geographical location. But behind the numbers lies an uncomfortable truth. Nigeria remains deeply dependent on the United States and Western countries for both its economy and security. Nearly 90% of Nigeria's export revenue comes from oil, and most of it is exported to developed countries, especially the United States. If the US falls into recession and oil prices plummet, Nigeria will immediately lose its main source of revenue to sustain its already fragile economy. Not only that, Nigeria is also the second largest recipient of humanitarian aid and medical support from the United States. From vaccines, food supplies to counterterrorism programs, the presence of the US has been and continues to maintain a part of stability here. If Washington has to cut its aid budget, Nigeria will be exposed to crises in health, education, and security. But who will bear the first loss? Not the government officials, but ordinary people who have already been living in deprivation. Imagine a child in Lagos who cannot go to school because the education program has been cut. A mother cannot take her child to the hospital because the local health center has no medicine left. A father lost his job when oil prices collapsed and the company cut jobs. Where will they go? How will they live? If the United States, the world's leader, collapses, Nigeria will bear the consequences in the most brutal way, not on the financial market, but in every meal, every abandoned hospital, every unfulfilled dream of its people. A country may have resources, people, and potential, but if the system is abandoned and hope is gone, will they ever be able to stand up on their own? When talking about economic recession, we often only think of the stock market in turmoil, skyrocketing interest rates, or the domestic unemployment rate. But the reality is, a sneeze from America can make the whole world catch a cold. From factories in South Korea to farms in Brazil, from urban Mexico to fishing villages in Nigeria, millions of people live in economies tightly bound to the financial health of the United States. And if America sinks into recession, many countries, like the names on this list, may not be able to hold on. But the most concerning thing is that the poor, the elderly, migrant workers, single mothers, and children will be the ones who suffer first and most deeply. They are not the ones who made the wrong investments, nor are they the ones who set the policies. But they will be the ones who no longer have enough money to eat, no medicine to take, and have to leave their homeland to find a chance to survive. Which other countries do you think will be most severely affected if the US goes into recession? Please share your perspective in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on in-depth analyses and the real stories behind the numbers. The video content is analytical and predictive in nature, not intended for investment or political purposes. All data is compiled from public sources and may change over time. We encourage you to follow with an open heart and consult additional sources.